The recovered Vox recordings and iterant remembrancer transcripts present a consistent pattern: fragmented visual records, partial registry entries, and eyewitness depositions that were catalogued, redacted, and then physically excised from the investory and associated archive stacks. These materials arrive as fragments, charred folios, corrupted holoplates, and the occasional intact iterant that survived an otherwise deliberate purge. Analysts who have examined the fragments describe an early chronological layer in which statues and memorial plaques once accounted for a full complement of 20 progenitors. Later layers show systematic blacking out, excision marks of a nature that suggests deliberate censorship rather than accidental loss. When pict feeds of the Imperial Palace are replayed in controlled environments, corridor scans imply the prior existence of two plinths, or niches, whose inscriptions and imagery were intentionally removed, their surrounding masonry left finished but uninscribed. The pattern repeats in later archival strata. Where a full roster should appear, only a series of 18 confirmed names remain, and 2 positions appear as deliberate voids. The surviving catalogues therefore offer a history in which the number 20 remains the backdrop, even as 2 of that number are absent from the record. Archaeological and documentary fragments converge in a single constrained hypothesis. At some point prior to the collection of full Imperial commemorative records, 2 Primarchs and their legions were intentionally erased from standard account and memorial. This erasure manifests not as negligence but as policy. The removal is not limited to inscriptions. It extends to bureaucratic registries, gene seed inventories that later resurfaces in guarded Technic archives, and cross-reference genealogies of legion companies. Where the physical traces remain, those traces suggest a dual approach. First, a bureaucratic redaction that strips naming and lineage from public logs. Second, a technical preservation of genetic and mechanica matter in restricted repositories that did not wholly disappear. This bifurcated treatment, public expunction and private retention, indicates an institutional decision at or above the level of the highest central authorities to conceal the memory of these 2 Primarchs from the Imperium at large while nonetheless preserving certain material elements for controlled scientific use. Modern scholarship often frames this as deliberate suppression rather than mere loss. The material context of the redaction is important because it shapes plausible explanations for what occurred. Contemporary archivists note that full-scale purges of this kind are logistically complex. They require chained orders, coordinated access to numerous independent repositories, and a willingness to overwrite public ceremony with silence. In practice, the physical removal of inscriptions and the addition of censor bands in printed and plated records would have been executed across multiple departments: investory, liturgical iter, and the custodes charged with palace security. Such operations leave a traceable logistic signature: inconsistent wear on plaque grooves, mismatched mortar where inscriptions were removed, and, in textual artifacts, lines of black where names and identifying marks once stood. Where gene seed inventories are concerned, surviving testimony and recovered logs indicate that gene seed associated with the 2 excised legions persisted in Mechanica stores well after the public archival redaction. This persistence is not incidental. It denotes a technical recognition that the biological material and the warriors derived from it retain tactical and scientific utility, irrespective of their historical expunction. That reality complicates any explanation which would assert that the 2 Primarchs simply never existed. The archival record argues that they once did and were later removed. Primary eyewitness testimony, where it can be authenticated, adds further texture. A small number of veterans from successor chapters and retired iterators record hazy contact with personnel who served in legions identified only in personal notes as the 2nd and 11th formations before redactions took effect. These first-hand fragments are often second order, retainers from adjacent legions who recall reassignment orders annotated with redacted commands, or remembrancers who annotated their notes with deliberate gaps and later marginalia, explaining that passages had been censured. The language in these marginalia is cautious and administrative. references to purge, censure, and inquisitorial oversight occur more than once. The precise wording and the presence of formal censorship seals in multiple independent sources indicate that the excision was not an improvised act by low-level clerks, but an adjudicated policy that invoked extraordinary authority. Where direct eyewitness accounts attempt causal explanation, they tend toward two poles. Either the Primarchs were judged to have failed in a manner that required removal from the record, or they were the subject of such taboo knowledge that their names themselves became destabilizing and thus had to be erased. Neither hypothesis is conclusively provable from the witnesses alone, but both are consistent with the scale and coordination implied by the surviving physical evidence. The chronological placement of the redaction is a critical constraint. Scholars have tied the break in the record to a pre-heresy timeframe, noting that records compiled during monumental events such as monarchic proclamations and the Ulanor convergence continue to reference only 18 legions. The absence is therefore not a post-heresy phenomenon attributable to the subsequent civil war alone. Rather, the 2 legions were missing from influential public enumerations before or early within the period of the Great Crusade's maturation into larger imperial politics. This temporal placement matters for interpretation, because it implies the excision occurred while the Emperor was still actively consolidating power, and while the Primarch project remained a central, ongoing enterprise. If deliberate removal occurred at that stage, then it required not only authority but also an authoritative rationale, something sufficiently weighty to justify erasure before the universe, altering events that followed. The redaction thus predates the mass upheavals that later obfuscated many records, and it must be understood as part of the institutional governance of the Imperium in the later stages of the Great Crusade. Technical archives, when allowed limited scrutiny, provide the most concrete foothold. Several controlled transmissions originate in Adeptus Mechanicus vaults and in the whispered transcripts of Archmagus proxies. Those transmissions confirm the retention of gene stocks correlated with the numbered legions that were absent from public registries. In the fiction recently circulated in primary novels, and amplified by later iterant summaries, agents working under the Archmagos Belisarius call, or his proxies reference experiments on gene seed that include lines associated with the 2 excised legions. That material fact, gene seed preserved and experimentally referenced, demonstrates that the biological templates were not destroyed in an effort to erase evidence. Instead, they were quarantined and analysed, sometimes used and sometimes withheld from mass application. That behaviour reveals an institutional calculus. Biological assets could be pragmatically reused or studied, even when political considerations demanded historical silence. The reappearance of those gene stocks in modern experimental contexts is treated in current fiction and technical commentary as confirmation that the biological legacies of the Lost Legions survived their historical abrasia. The archival synthesis gives rise to a narrow set of viable theories. One theory posits a moral or political failure of the Primarchs themselves, judged by an authority sufficient to order expunction. Under this reading, the 2 are not merely military failures, but were adjudged as liabilities whose continued remembrance risked institutional destabilization. Another theory treats the erasure as an act of political necessity, produced by a context in which tacit compromise and violent suppression were tools of statecraft. The 2 Primarchs may have committed acts that, if disclosed, would have undermined the Emperor's broader program or created intolerable schisms among the legions. A third, less judgmental hypothesis suggests that the 2 fell victim to a series of circumstances so anomalous, prior phenomena, lost in warp events, or uniquely disruptive xenocult interactions, that the Imperium chose pragmatic silence to avoid contagion of fear or doctrinal uncertainty. Each theory accommodates the central empirical observations, visible redaction, private retention of material, and early chronological placement, while diverging sharply on causation and moral framing. In current scholarship, none of these hypotheses can be presented as definitive. All remain interpretations that weigh different elements of the partial record. Beyond institutional motives, the human and cultural consequences of such erasure are significant. A Primarch's removal from Memorial does not simply alter a roster, it reshapes the genealogy of legions, the liturgical calendars of worlds, and the self-conception of successor chapters. Successor groups that might have claimed lineage from those legions found their histories made ambiguous, and liturgies that once celebrated a patron were left with lacunae. Where the gene stocks survived in caches, later technophiles and Archmagos relic hunters treated those caches as artifacts of contested authority, objects whose use could be interpreted as rehabilitation, experimentation, or heresy, depending on context. The social reality inside legions and of worlds that once served under those banners is therefore one of ruptured narrative. The removal not only deleted names but also severed a sense of continuous identity that normally joins warrior, homeworld, and Primarch across generations. That identity rupture has continued to produce rumour, poeticized memory, and at times dangerous myth-making that the Imperium has sought to control through further censorship. Finally, the scarce direct references in contemporary primary novels and authorized texts complicate the picture in ways that are important to record. Where modern sources do touch upon the missing pair, they use language that is suggestive rather than declarative. A received passage attributed to a present Primarch in recent narrative fiction frames the issue succinctly. It acknowledges the original count of 20, admits 2 failures, and frames the remaining divisions as a mixture of betrayal and survival. Interpretive passages from technarchaeological proxies add further nuance by arguing that the warriors were not at fault, that the science remained usable, and that the Primarchs themselves bore the core responsibility for whatever judged failure occurred. Those textual traces do not resolve the matter. They do, however, confirm that the gap in public memory is matched by an underlying recognition across administrative and technical spheres that the absence is consequential. Modern institutional actors thereby treat the 2 missing Primarchs as both a historical lacuna and an operational hazard, one that requires secrecy and technical caution in equal measure. Collectively, the pict-feed fragments, the physical signs of excision, the preserved gene stocks, and restrained narrative references converge on a conclusion that is modest in its certainty. 2 Primarchs and their associated legions were once integral to the original project, and later they were excised from Imperial commemoration through deliberate administrative action, while certain technical assets linked to them were retained under controlled conditions. That conclusion does not explain motive or detail action. It defines a factual scaffold upon which interpretive work must proceed. The archive thus offers a twofold lesson. It demands that investigators treat absence as meaningful data, and that any theory of motive must reconcile a deliberate early excision with the simultaneous preservation of biologically valuable material. The Lost Primarchs therefore occupy a peculiar place in the Imperial record. Deleted from the public memorial, but persistent in the material substrata of the Imperium's technoscientific apparatus. It is a defining feature of the Imperial record that no authenticated pict-capture, biometric template, or gene schema of the 2 excised Primarchs has ever surfaced in open archives. The few references that remain are indirect. Comparative annotations in Mechanicus treatises, references to biological anomalies within the Primarch gene seed array, and secondary notations in custodial logs that correlate with the design and performance parameters of the Primarch project as a whole. These surviving data fragments, when studied collectively, form a pattern distinct enough to support limited qualitative reconstruction of the lost progenitor's physiological and tactical traits. The results remain theoretical, but they carry internal coherence when measured against the known genetic and cultural architectures of their surviving brothers. Gene archaeologists from the Martian Scolum of Selenica have identified that the Primarchs were not produced in identical conditions. Each was designed as a deliberate variation upon a shared human template, augmented by specific enhancements to complement diverse theatres of war. The Emperor's laboratory protocols, where decipherable, reveal systematic diversity, an effort to design multiple ideal commanders suited to varying strategic needs. The surviving evidence implies that each of the 20 Primarchs embodied a different synthesis of physical, psychological and environmental adaptability. It is therefore consistent to assume that the two missing Primarchs were created to fill particular strategic niches that would later be absent from the operational record. What limited cross-reference exists comes from early Mechanicum codifications describing the primary genome mapping array. The array enumerates 20 optimized sequences, each possessing unique clusters of neural, endocrine, and somatic adaptations. 2 of those clusters are marked as pattern withdrawn. The context suggests the data were not corrupted but intentionally restricted. One pattern, later inferred by Mechanicus logicians to have emphasized neural plasticity and environmental reconfiguration, appears to have corresponded to a Primarch whose aptitude lay in adaptive warfare, rapid response, dynamic learning, and unconventional theatre application. The second withdrawn pattern demonstrates elevated aggression modulation and a correlation with psychosocial resonance networks, a scientific description of what could be emotional contagion, or the ability to stabilize or destabilize mass morale through presence alone. These scientific notations do not assign names or identifiers, but they do define 2 missing archetypes: the adaptive strategist and the morale manipulator. It is believed that the Primarch later correlated with the adaptive pattern may have exhibited a phenotype markedly different from his siblings. The records of Primarch physiology suggest most exceeded normal human scale, ranging between 3.2 and 3.7 meters in height, with bone density exceeding baseline by an order of magnitude. The adaptive template, however, contained metabolic regulators not seen in the others. Some Mechanicus scholars propose that this may have allowed for controlled variance in size and structure depending on environment, leading to a more flexible morphology rather than a single fixed form. If true, it would have granted extraordinary survivability on worlds with unstable gravity or atmospheric composition. Others suggest the term adaptive referred instead to neural flexibility, the ability to integrate new forms of tactical information, pattern recognition, and alien environmental data at rates surpassing even other Primarchs. This capacity would have made him a uniquely valuable explorer and strategist during the earliest expansion phases of the Great Crusade. Descriptions of the morale-oriented genome pattern hint at a more psychological focus. Some speculate that this Primarch's defining feature was a heightened empathic interface with his warriors, a biologically mediated charisma capable of synchronizing emotional states across an entire legion. His genome sequence shows anomalies in the limbic augmentation cluster, suggesting modulation of hormonal signaling beyond what was required for personal combat enhancement. If such a design existed, it would have produced a leader capable of generating collective fervor, or conversely, controlling aggression with precision. It is not difficult to imagine how such influence could have been a powerful tool during the early unification campaigns, when the nascent legions were still unstable, and the concept of loyalty to a distant emperor required emotional as well as rational allegiance. The same capacity, however, could also have represented a severe liability. Should such a Primarch deviate from Imperial doctrine, the same empathic influence that unified could become contagion for rebellion. Evidence for physical distinction derives from indirect sources. Fragmentary maintenance logs of artificer armor and weapon requisitions recorded under erased Legion identifiers. One recurring designation refers to Legionary Pattern Beta 4, recorded as employing modular exo-armature systems with interchangeable field couplings. The description diverges from the fixed armor profiles common to early Mark II and Mark III plate, instead indicating a chassis that could accept localized upgrades without full resmelting. Some Mechanicus historians infer this belonged to the Adaptive Legion, which favoured constant environmental recalibration. Their armour may have been lighter in standard form but capable of scaling to heavier configurations depending on deployment world. This would suggest a legion specialising in rapid redeployment and frontier adaptation, troops able to reconfigure armour seals, weapon housings, and exo-locomotive servos to suit terrain extremes. Another entry in the restricted archives of Lucius Forge mentions a rare pattern of close combat weapon, categorized as empathic feedback design, composed of psycho-reactive alloys and requiring synchronization with a Primarch-grade neural lattice. The corresponding maintenance report cites instability due to resonance overload, language consistent with weapons interfacing directly with user biometrics. Such constructs were discontinued after the heresy, but the presence of such a record before that era indicates their early experimentation. This weapon class is now believed to have been developed for the second Lost Primarch, the morale manipulator archetype, allowing him to channel or amplify emotional intensity into kinetic discharge. The design would have bordered on the forbidden, blending psi-reactive principles with physical armament in a manner that skirts both technological and psychic taboos. Both reconstructed archetypes, though conjectural, align with broader Primarch design principles observed in the confirmed 18. Each was built to exemplify an aspect of human mastery, strategy, loyalty, psychic stability, endurance, or faith. It is therefore consistent that the missing pair represented equally critical but risky aspects: the potential to adapt beyond doctrinal control and the power to influence others beyond reason. The Emperor's design logic would have required these extremes to be tested, even if they proved untenable. The surviving gene seed data fragments reinforce this. Among the stored material in Deep Mechanicus repositories, specific enzyme markers in 2 withdrawn sequences display irregular replication fidelity, suggesting that both lines experienced higher than average mutation drift when replicated outside laboratory conditions. This may have rendered their legions biologically volatile, necessitating extensive control protocols. The instability could have contributed to their ultimate erasure if it translated into unpredictable behavioral or psychological outcomes among the Astartes derived from them. Accounts attributed to early Mechanicum adepts who served during the Great Crusade describe experimental testing of power armor configurations, requiring continuous calibration to wearer biofeedback. The existence of such adaptive systems would explain certain energy signatures detected in long-range Auspex readings from uncharted battlefields later sealed by Imperial order. In one instance, a recovered helm fragment bearing the truncated sigil of a numerically ambiguous legion displayed microlattice construction capable of phase-tuning the user's sensory input spectrum. That level of sensory manipulation suggests the work of the adaptive legion's artificers. If correct, the legion's technology represented an early form of responsive warfare, armor and weapon systems that interpreted environment and combat stress as variables to be recalibrated, rather than constraints to be endured. The theoretical performance of such systems would have outpaced all other known armor marks of the period, but also required constant mechanicum oversight, potentially straining relations with the Forge worlds responsible for their maintenance. The supposed empathic Primarch's war gear, reconstructed through speculative cross-reference, would have reflected his psychological resonance. A class of power blade, thin, curved, almost ritualistic, appears in the forges of Antigone and disappears from inventory at approximately the same date that the 11th and 2nd Legions vanish from public record. The blade's monomolecular edge and psychometric stabilizers suggest a weapon designed not only to cut but to modulate kinetic discharge through the user's emotional state. Some fragmentary codicils even reference harmonic modulation, a term absent from any other legion's armory. Such a weapon would be unstable, capable of extreme precision or catastrophic self-destruction depending on the user's focus. If the Primarch's emotional influence was indeed a weaponized trait, it is possible that his armament functioned as a conductor of that energy. While these inferences paint an outline of individual characteristics, they also indicate how their legions may have operated. The Adaptive Legion likely specialized in reconnaissance, frontier colonization, and hostile environment warfare. Their strength would have been flexibility, deploying small, self-sufficient cohorts capable of transforming battlefield variables into advantage. Their command structure might have reflected this fluidity, less hierarchical, more networked, operating under broad directives rather than strict order of battle. Such behavior would have been at odds with the Imperial preference for rigid discipline and may have drawn scrutiny from both the Administratum and rival legions. The Empathic Legion, by contrast, would have emphasized unity and morale to a degree verging on collective identity. reports of chant-locked companies and synchronous assault waves in censored campaign data could represent this legion's combat method. Soldiers linked by training or biochemical conditioning to operate as extensions of their Primarch's will. To outside observers, their coordination would have appeared uncanny, perhaps even psychic. Some Mechanicus cogitator analyses warn that such synchronization could have been self-reinforcing. A single emotional deviation within the Primarch might have propagated instantly through the Legion. If such an event occurred, panic, despair, or rage, it could have precipitated catastrophic breakdown. This, some scholars argue, could explain why the Imperium chose not only to disband these legions, but to erase all reference to them. A failure so total and psychologically contagious might have threatened the stability of the Great Crusade itself. In the absence of direct testimony, this remains speculation, but the hypothesis matches the pattern of deliberate deletion observed in archival strata. In assessing their wargear holistically, the correlation between equipment and temperament emerges as a repeating pattern across all legions. Primarchs expressed their identity through armament, Vulcan through the forge, Ferrus Manus through mechanized precision, Fulgrim through artful excess. The adaptive Primarch's reliance on modular systems and morphic armor suggests pragmatism elevated to art, an aesthetic of transformation rather than ornamentation. His warriors may have displayed minimal heraldry, favoring functionality over ceremonial prioritization. The empathic Primarch's equipment, conversely, likely blended artistry with ritual purpose, creating weapons and armor that acted as both symbols and instruments of cohesion. Such dual-function design, though effective, would have invited suspicion from the more rational branches of the Imperium. A small number of redacted testimonies attributed to Legio Custodes detachments mention unnamed brothers whose presence distorted the mood of men and machine alike. The statement, though vague, resonates with the theorized empathic Primarch and his legion. If a Primarch could influence emotional states through proximity alone, even the stoic custodians might have perceived such presence as destabilizing. This, again, fits the pattern of containment, a trait too dangerous to wield publicly, too integral to destroy, leading to suppression as the only viable resolution. Technically, both archetypes would have relied on unique artificer cadres. For the adaptive legion, their armourers must have been mechanical savants, perpetually refining biosynchronization circuits. The empathic legion's artificers, meanwhile, would have been artisans and neuro-architects treating weaponry as psychological extensions. The dissolution of both legions would therefore have entailed not just military catastrophe, but also the loss of specialized technological traditions that might have advanced the Mechanicus' own science had they survived. It is telling that later epochs of Imperial history show a deliberate simplification of Astartes' wargear design, reducing individuality, standardizing forms, enforcing stability over innovation. Some technologists argue that this regression was an institutional response to the unpredictable consequences of the Lost Legion's experiments. In sum, the surviving data and reasoned inferences suggest that the two Lost Primarchs represented extremes of the Emperor's original intent. One embodied limitless adaptability, capable of surviving any condition, learning any system, and reshaping war to fit circumstance. The other embodied unity through shared motion, capable of transforming disparate soldiers into a single will. Both traits, though seemingly virtues, carry inherent risk when applied without constraint. Adaptability can lead to divergence, empathy can become contagion. The Emperor's attempt to harness these qualities may have succeeded biologically, but failed politically, forcing a choice between public continuity and secret containment. The weapons and armour once associated with these Primarchs, if they survived at all, would now exist as relics under the deepest sanction, misidentified as prototypes of other legions, or sealed as unstable archaeotech. Their genetic legacies, meanwhile, may persist within Mechanicus data cores, quietly influencing later gene line manipulations without overt acknowledgement. Thus, even in absence, the Lost Primarchs continue to shape the Imperium, ghosts encoded in the very genome and machine logic that define its warriors. Their erasure did not eliminate their influence. It only obscured it beneath the layers of bureaucracy, theology, and fear that guard the truth. The records of the two Lost Primarchs contain almost nothing in the way of personality data. Every official chronicle of the Great Crusade presents the Emperor's sons as defined archetypes: the warlord, the philosopher, the builder, the zealot. Yet the 2nd and 11th remain blank spaces in that otherwise perfect pattern. But the nature of absence itself leaves a trace. In comparative analysis, those gaps become shapes. Within Mechanicus data fragments and remembrancer logs, the behavioural tone of their legions can be faintly measured, giving outline, if not image, to the beings once called brothers by the known Primarchs. Where others inspired awe or devotion, the Lost Ones seem to inspire unease. Not hatred, not heresy, but something closer to discord, the kind of tension that distorts even loyalty. Scattered command fragments from the early Crusade list campaigns, reassigned from the 2nd and 11th to other expeditionary fleets, with notes referencing doctrinal isolation, non-compliant conditioning, or restructuring of gene legacy protocols. In every case, the Emperor's will acted swiftly and silently afterward. From these faint signals, one can infer at least partial psychological outlines. The Primarch of the 2nd Legion may have displayed traits of absolute detachment, an intellect that viewed the Crusade's expansion less as conquest and more as a forced synchronization of human diversity. In contrast, the 11th may have embodied the opposite, a dangerously human empathy, unwilling to tolerate the scale of devastation the Imperium deemed necessary. If true, these temperaments would place both at odds with the underlying logic of Imperial unity, one too dispassionate to serve mankind's emotional core, the other too compassionate to serve its ruthless purpose. Their alignment within the Imperial hierarchy was likely fractured even before their removal. Early Mechanicum transmission logs mention genetic symbiosis experimentation related to proto-augmentation systems, possibly tied to one of the Lost Legions. Such collaboration hints at a Primarch whose goals extended beyond pure warfare, perhaps delving into post-human development or consciousness engineering. Others speculate that one of the Lost Legions maintained closer ties to the Astra Militarum's precursor forces or Imperial Compliance Corps, suggesting a Primarch focused on human integration rather than superhuman dominance. Both paths, though opposite in intent, would be condemned by the Emperor once they began to diverge from his absolute vision of order. Among the surviving Primarchs, brief reactions support this polarity. Russ spoke once of the shame we do not name. Gilliman's Codex Historius omits 2 fleet records with deliberate precision. Vulcan referred cryptically to the brother who loved too greatly and the one who saw too much. Even these oblique fragments suggest that the Emperor's sons recognized the duality, 2 opposite failures, bound by the same final consequence. The purging of their memory was total, not simply death, but deletion from all cultural and psychic resonance. The Primarch project, after all, was not a biological experiment, but an ideological one. When a design corrupted its intended archetype, it was not enough to end the life. The pattern itself had to be removed from the universal myth. The Lost Primarchs, therefore, represent the Emperor's attempt to protect the sanctity of the dream, to erase his own mistakes from the psychic lattice of mankind. And yet, despite every effort, traces persist. Gene seed catalogues list 2 anomalous code strains that appear in recovered Mechanicus databanks, each corrupted beyond viable use, but retaining partial compatibility with the baseline Astartes genome. One carries residual psychic amplification signatures, the other, metabolic regulation markers consistent with extreme neural empathy. These fragments do not confirm survival, but they prove existence, proof that something was once there, then violently excised. To the scholars of the present era, this erasure itself defines the Lost Primarchs more than any act of glory could. Where others' legacies are recorded in victories and betrayals, theirs exist in silence, a deliberate silence engineered by the Emperor, enforced by his sons, and perpetuated by every order of the Imperium that came after. Inquisition records later categorized the event as dual abrogation, a term not found elsewhere in Imperial lexicon. Abrogation implies nullification of command, removal of right, and the dissolution of lineage. In this context, it suggests not rebellion but rejection. Not that the Primarchs turned from the Emperor, but that he turned from them. Whether this was mercy, punishment, or self-correction will forever remain beyond certainty. When viewed through the broader structure of the Great Crusade, the Lost Primarchs embody the inherent flaw of Imperial design, the tension between perfection and humanity. The Primarchs were not gods, they were prototypes of what mankind could be, shaped by divinity but born of mortal vision. In that light, the two who vanished might have been the most human of all, and therefore the least compatible with an empire that demanded purity above empathy and control above conscience. Their deletion left more than a hole in the records, it left a warning. Every empire that seeks perfection must first erase what reminds it of its own imperfection. The Emperor did not simply lose two sons, he sacrificed the reflection of his own limits. The Imperium that followed was built upon that silence, and its shadow endures in every generation that still calls him infallible. The matter of the Lost Primarchs has long been dismissed as a void deliberately maintained within Imperial records, yet within the silent recesses of the Administratum's deeper strata, traces of their existence continue to echo through the systems designed to conceal them. These echoes are not in the form of names or events, but in the irregular patterns of data omission, the abrupt terminations of logistical reports, and the statistical aberrations left in the wake of their redaction. When analysed by Administratum data clerks and Mechanicus adepts, these irregularities form a faint constellation, a pattern suggesting that two immense military-industrial entities were once fully integrated into the early Great Crusade framework, only to vanish without procedural precedent. Adeptus Administratum internal records maintain standardized templates for the cataloging of Primarch deployment resources, fleet tonnage, planetary requisitions, and gene seed batch distributions. These documents, numbering in the millions, were copied and transcribed across millennia, 40 and 41, their preservation assisted by cogitator redundancy. Within these data streams, however, there are identifiable discontinuities, blank designations following the 8th and before the 11th Primarch entries. These interruptions are accompanied by inconsistent timestamp hierarchies, indicating that they were not lost to entropy or data decay, but actively overwritten through an administrative process. In the few surviving fragments from the unpurged early Great Crusade ledgers, there appear instances where total planetary compliance statistics were misaligned by up to 2 full percent. To the Mechanicus, this statistical void was not an accident. It represented the loss of millions of tons of material, ship manifests, and war gear unaccounted for, which must have once belonged to now deleted legions. The Adeptus Mechanicus, more reliant on their own archives preserved through data caskets and quantum-etched metal script, approach the question from a technical standpoint. They identify specific genetic and cybernetic anomalies in recovered Astartes data samples that cannot be cleanly attributed to any of the remaining known legions. These samples, largely recovered from worlds burned during the Unification Wars and early expansion of the Great Crusade, exhibit a degree of stability inconsistent with the chaotic mutations seen in later corrupted gene lines. Some Mechanicus logicians infer from this that the genetic templates of the missing Primarchs represented transitional prototypes, an intermediary phase between the original Primarch creation and the refined gene seed later used for mass Astartes production. If true, this would mean that the lost legions were not removed simply for moral or political reasons, but because their existence exposed the biological imperfections of the Emperor's earliest attempts at creating his sons. Administratum subdivisions responsible for interdepartmental communication between the Munitorum and the Office of Compliance have also been noted to omit 2 specific expeditionary fleets from their manifest records, identified only through the numbering gaps within the Primarch Deployment Index. Fleet numbering patterns show that every confirmed Primarch corresponded to a defined expeditionary grouping, except for the missing ones. The absence of their fleet codes is not random. They are deliberately reassigned to later campaigns, a form of administrative recycling done only when an index has been voided by executive order. In bureaucratic language, this would mean the erasure was not just physical or historical, but systemic, integrated into the Imperium's paper trail itself, sealing the absence beneath procedural compliance. The Mechanicus perspective remains divided. Some Magi consider the erasure a data purification rite, an act of technological heresy cleansing, wherein all trace of flawed constructs must be purged from the machine god's record. Others believe it to be an act of containment, intended to prevent the replication of unstable technologies linked to the missing Primarchs' legions. One obscure theory, whispered in the synaptic cogitator circles of Mars Noctis Clade, asserts that the genetic architecture of the Lost Primarchs bore adaptive properties that conflicted with the Emperor's intended design purity. Such properties may have caused their gene seed to manifest unpredictable psychological patterns, capable of diverging entire legions' temperaments beyond Imperial control. From a logistical standpoint, the resource discrepancies associated with the erased legions are staggering. Early Crusade material ledgers indicate an estimated 200,000 Astartes unaccounted for by any surviving chapter lineage. That number, even if partially inflated by transcription error, would correspond to 2 full legions operating at near-peak strength. The Administratum's attempts to normalize these figures through bureaucratic reclassification, labeling them as training losses or unverified gene seed disposal, are statistically implausible. This numerical inconsistency becomes more troubling when cross-referenced with early fleet loss records, where entire strike groups vanish from the register between campaigns in Segmentum Pacificus and Segmentum Solar. There are fragments of Mechanicus communiques that speak of unrecoverable compliance failures on several pre-compliance worlds, including a planet whose designation was later reassigned to the Segmentum Obscurus Warzone Registry. The recovered message headers bear authentication marks from a Martian expeditionary forge, dated to the latter half of the Great Crusade, and refer to an unacceptable deviation in command autonomy regarding one of the missing legions. While the language is mechanical and devoid of emotional inflection, its implication is clear. A legion may have acted without Imperial authorization, an act that, to both the Mechanicus and the Administratum, would constitute a violation of the Crusade's core doctrine of control. It is also noted that after the 2 legions' erasure, subsequent logistical documents show a deliberate tightening of the resource authorization process for all remaining Primarchs. The number of Mechanicus tech priests embedded in expeditionary fleets increases, supply chain redundancies are added, and the autonomy of individual Primarchs becomes progressively constrained. The administrative evidence therefore implies that the erasure had long-lasting systemic consequences, essentially forcing the Imperium to regulate its own demigods. When the data adepts of the Lathe Worlds performed their own audit of ancient genetic samples, recovered from the Saturnine genetic archives, they recorded several entries marked with the term Index Redactus Primis et Secundus. The term's use of binaric enumeration strongly suggests the acknowledgement of 2 specific data voids rather than a general classification. Cross-referencing these markings with Crusade-era genome distribution ledgers points toward 2 unique gene print signatures that were once registered but later nullified through what the Mechanicus refer to as a purge chain overwrite. This is a process reserved only for instances of total technological quarantine. For the Mechanicus to employ such a measure upon genetic data implies that they viewed the missing Primarchs not simply as failed assets, but as biological threats whose continued reference could endanger the sanctity of the human genome itself. Adeptus Administratum scholars have, in the millennia since, debated whether the 2 lost legions were destroyed, absorbed, or simply reassigned under new designations. The analytical consensus, based on supply chain absence and inconsistent troop distribution data, leans toward annihilation. Yet the recorded numbers of gene seed samples marked for reclamation do not match the expected total of 2 obliterated legions. There are too few. This mathematical inconsistency haunts every analysis. the numbers imply that a portion of those forces survived the official purges. Whether they were reabsorbed into other formations or lost beyond Imperial record remains unconfirmed. Mechanicus data reconstruction algorithms trained on early Terran archival syntax estimate that the deletion of the two Primarchs' records required an operation involving over 12,000 individual document edits across planetary, fleet, and forge registries. Such a massive synchronized alteration could only have been authorized by the Emperor himself or by the Sigillite operating under Imperial mandate. This logistical fact underscores the depth of the purge. It was not an act of censorship, but one of engineered amnesia. Both the Administratum and the Mechanicus conclude that the erasure of the two Primarchs and their legions was absolute in its intention, but imperfect in execution. Enough residual data survived through material cross-indexes, manufacturing ledgers, and fleet deployment logs to betray the truth. The Imperium had once contained two additional armies of transhuman warriors, each with its own chain of command, armor patterns, and genetic lineage. Their disappearance was not due to obscurity, but to an intentional design meant to protect the coherence of Imperial mythos. To acknowledge them openly would have been to admit that the Emperor's great design, crafted through divine precision, had faltered twice. From the analytical viewpoint of the Mechanicus, the deletion is interpreted less as moral judgment and more as a matter of systemic correction. A flawed code line is purged to preserve the whole. Yet within this reasoning lies a quiet contradiction. The machine god demands the preservation of knowledge, while the erasure of the Primarchs represents a deliberate suppression of it. Administratum scribes have long noted this irony, recording it with restrained disapproval in the private annotations of the Archivum Prohibitum. What remains, after all the cross-checked figures and analysis, is not a question of morality or betrayal, but one of control. The Adeptus Administratum and Mechanicus jointly acknowledge that the scale of the erasure could not have been achieved without coordination at the highest echelon of power. Every remaining trace of the Lost Primarchs, therefore, is not merely a curiosity of forgotten history, but an operational scar embedded in the Imperium's very system of record-keeping. The record of the Lost Primarchs' military engagements is fragmented, reconstructed primarily from cross-references within surviving Administratum dossiers, Mechanicus, operational logs, and censored campaign reports. While no official war records bear their names, the patterns of fleet deployment, planetary compliance missions, and Astartes unit allocations strongly suggest their participation in multiple early campaigns of the Great Crusade. These campaigns, though officially unattributed, provide insight into their operational philosophy and combat behaviour. The first inferred theatre of engagement is believed to have been the subsector Ephira system, consisting of 3 uncharted worlds designated solely for early colonisation and stabilisation operations. Mechanicus records indicate that an Astartes contingent with a unique armour and power weapon signature was deployed to suppress native resistance and establish orbital command infrastructure. Fleet tonnage manifests and logistic registers show that the contingent operated independently of the 4th and 9th Legions, with command directives suggesting direct coordination only with high-level administratum liaisons. Some historians interpret this as evidence of one Lost Primarch's adaptive strategic preference, favouring autonomy over rigid hierarchical control. Troop movements, as reconstructed from orbit-to-surface supply data, indicate highly flexible formations, often redeploying entire companies within hours to respond to environmental or tactical shifts. Simultaneously, records suggest that the second Lost Primarch's forces were engaged in operations on the industrial world of Garvan Secundus. Surviving logistical reports note unusually synchronized assaults on multiple fortified positions, executed with a precision inconsistent with the independent operational doctrines of other legions. Some speculate that this legion emphasized psychological cohesion and morale, orchestrating coordinated strikes in which units functioned as near-perfect extensions of central command. Tactical logs, though heavily redacted, describe company-wide psychic resonance and simultaneous breach execution, implying that soldiers operated in close emotional and procedural synchronization, likely directed through the Primarch's presence. Battlefield reconstructions from the subsector Ephyra engagements, cross-referenced with surviving Mechanicus sensor logs, indicate that the Adaptive Legion excelled in dynamic terrain utilization. Troops frequently exploited environmental variables, gravity differentials, atmospheric density and geologic formations to maximize mobility and minimize casualties. Some reports, while unconfirmed, suggest that the Primarch's personal command style encouraged decentralized decision-making, allowing small detachments to act independently while maintaining alignment with overall strategic objectives. This operational flexibility created an unpredictability that confounded opposing forces, resulting in rapid planetary pacification with fewer losses than contemporaneous campaigns by known legions. In contrast, the presumed empathic legion demonstrated a radically different approach. Surviving supply chain annotations note precise timing and sequencing of material distribution, implying pre-battle conditioning of both troops and environment. Strategists within the Administratum hypothesize that this reflected the Primarch's philosophy of harmonized warfare. Every unit, down to support cadres, functioned in synchrony. Sensor logs contain cryptic references to psychic coherence augmentation, suggesting that troops were trained or conditioned to operate as a single unit through emotional or neurological resonance, a practice unlike that of any other legion. While the data is incomplete, battlefield patterns imply assaults executed with extraordinary coordination, in which morale and cohesion were leveraged as force multipliers, amplifying the combat effectiveness of smaller detachments against larger unprepared opponents. The Adaptive Legion's combat doctrine, as inferred from sparse tactical communiques, also emphasized rapid integration of captured technologies and environmental adaptation. Reports indicate that during operations on mountainous and volcanic worlds, the Legion's armor systems were frequently modified in field to respond to thermal stress or shifting terrain. Artificer logs document repeated modifications to power armor and field weapons, often completed without centralized direction, implying a highly autonomous workflow under the Primarch's guidance. Mechanicus analysts consider this a deliberate test of operational flexibility, designed to maximize survivability and adaptability across varied theaters of war. Conversely, the Empathic Legion style leaned toward consolidation and unity rather than improvisation. Campaign reconstructions suggest that even in dynamically changing environments, units maintained predetermined formations and synchronized assault patterns. Logistic tables recovered from early conquest theaters indicate that supply allocations and reinforcement scheduling were meticulously coordinated to support this approach. Some analysts propose that this emphasis on precision and cohesion arose from the Primarch's unique influence on the soldiers themselves, a combination of biological predisposition and training that allowed troops to anticipate commands intuitively, functioning almost as a single organism under centralized leadership. Several indirect engagements provide additional insight. Surviving Administratum reports from the orbital stabilization of Hades Reach reference multiple planetary defense systems neutralized with minimal casualties, with later revisions excising references to Legion identifiers. Sensor logs, partially preserved, reveal signatures of advanced power armor types and psycho-reactive melee weaponry, consistent with previously inferred archetypes of the Lost Primarchs forces. These engagements indicate that the Adaptive Legion was more likely to employ flanking maneuvers, infiltration, and guerrilla-style tactics, while the Empathic Legion prioritized synchronized mass assaults and morale-driven breakthroughs. Some logistical anomalies suggest that both legions were capable of independent resource management, an unusual feature given the Imperium's centralized doctrine. Supply requisitions for both legions frequently bypass standard channels, appearing instead in specialized high-priority distribution nodes. Mechanicus memos indicate that this autonomy was monitored but tolerated, implying a calculated risk. The Emperor or his senior aides may have believed that these Primarchs' unique abilities justified the deviation from conventional oversight. These same deviations, however, may have contributed to concerns that ultimately led to the erasure of both legions. Autonomous operations on such a scale created data inconsistencies, unpredictable battle outcomes, and potential long-term destabilization of the Great Crusade's logistics network. Further indications of combat behavior emerge from surviving casualty reports. Estimates derived from planetary stabilization operations show extraordinarily low friendly losses for forces employing the adaptive strategy, suggesting an operational doctrine emphasizing survivability, rapid adaptation, and minimal exposure. Conversely, casualty records for the Empathic Legion, though incomplete, indicate precise coordination but occasionally higher losses, possibly due to the inherent risk of synchronized assaults relying heavily on unit cohesion. Both patterns underscore complementary extremes, one optimized for adaptability and preservation, the other for precision and concentrated impact. Notably, some reports allude to engagements with alien combatants unrecorded in mainstream campaign logs. Administratum archivists note references to unclassified Xenos irregulars in regions corresponding to later Imperial subsector maps. Sensor traces suggest both Lost Legions engaged these forces differently. The Adaptive Legion appears to have employed rapid, iterative engagement strategies, observing, assessing, and exploiting weaknesses, while the Empathic Legion executed coordinated, overwhelming strikes designed to neutralize threats through psychological dominance and synchronized tactical pressure. Whether these encounters were successful or costly remains unconfirmed, though some sources suggest that the outcomes reinforced the Imperium's later preference for more standardized Astartes operational doctrine. Across all inferred campaigns, a recurring theme is evident. Both Lost Primarchs operated as catalysts for extremity. The Adaptive Primarch created legions capable of unprecedented tactical flexibility and environmental adaptation, while the Empathic Primarch created legions capable of near-perfect cohesion and morale amplification. Both forms, while exceptional in performance, carried systemic risks. Unchecked adaptability could lead to divergence from Imperial objectives, while excessive synchronization risked catastrophic failure if central command was compromised. These dynamics, when assessed retrospectively, may explain why the Imperium ultimately chose deletion over continued operation. The operational history of the Lost Primarchs, though fragmentary, continues to emerge when examining supplemental battle and logistical records across the early Great Crusade. Administratum cross-references indicate 2 additional theatres of engagement, both of which provide evidence of operational methods distinct from those of known legions. One theatre encompasses the inner system of Helion Prime, where surviving supply and sensor logs suggest a series of rapid pacification campaigns. Mechanicus transmission reconstructions indicate that one of the Lost Legions employed high-mobility strike detachments using atmospheric insertion and subterranean traversal to neutralize resistance with minimal surface engagement. Reports, though incomplete, imply these operations were executed independently from concurrent fleet movements, bypassing typical coordination protocols. A second theatre, inferred from fragmentary planetary requisition records and early Crusade intelligence logs, points to a multi-world operation in the Tigris cluster. Administratum memos reference the sudden redeployment of material reserves previously allocated to other legions, annotated with phrases such as reassignment pending field evaluation and unverified command directive. Mechanicus analysis interprets these notes as evidence that the missing Primarchs exercised a degree of autonomy in both supply management and operational planning that exceeded that of their contemporaries. The surviving logs further suggest that both Primarchs were capable of integrating large-scale infrastructure engineering with tactical combat, constructing fortifications, logistical hubs, and orbital staging platforms while simultaneously leading strike operations. Details of these additional conflicts remain elusive. Battle sensors retrieved from suborbital monitoring satellites occasionally record atypical energy signatures and troop deployments inconsistent with surviving Legion archetypes. Some scholars infer from the cadence and dispersion of these operations that the Adaptive Legion may have experimented with early forms of networked command. allowing distributed companies to operate semi-independently while maintaining a cohesive operational objective. Conversely, the Empathic Legion's deployments appear to reflect rigid coordination across all echelon levels, with centralized command ensuring uniform execution of complex maneuvers. Casualty reports and material expenditure data for these campaigns present a striking contrast. The Adaptive Legion appears to have sustained relatively low losses, implying high survivability in unpredictable environments while achieving rapid campaign objectives. By contrast, the Empathic Legion, despite its meticulous coordination, exhibits higher recorded attrition in certain encounters, suggesting that its doctrinal reliance on synchronization may have introduced vulnerabilities when confronted with chaotic battlefield conditions or environmental disruption. These observations align with previous assessments of the Lost Primarchs' operational philosophies, one emphasizing adaptability and decentralized initiative, the other emphasizing unity and precise coordination. The aftermath of these engagements, however, is where Administratum and Mechanicus records converge to provide insight into the eventual erasure of the Lost Primarchs. Following the Tigris cluster operations, sudden lapses appear in deployment logs, supply requisition chains, and gene seed distribution records. Documentation notes fleet reassignment required, or command line nullified, and in several instances, whole planetary operations were reassigned without explanation. Mechanicus engineering logs corroborate these irregularities, recording numerous instances of purge chain activation and data overwrite protocol in relation to materials and biological samples associated with the Lost Legions. These anomalies suggest a deliberate removal of all operational and logistical traces from both the material and bureaucratic record. Administratum analysts have speculated that the removal was precipitated by concerns over autonomous operation. The scale of independent command exercised by the Lost Primarchs, as inferred from supply chain anomalies, fleet deployment inconsistencies, and partially surviving battle data, pose systemic risks. Entire planetary operations conducted under the Adaptive Legion's direction could theoretically diverge from the Emperor's overarching objectives, while the Empathic Legion's precise synchronization might amplify catastrophic failure in the event of command disruption. The combination of these factors likely rendered both Primarchs incompatible with the Imperium's long-term strategic model, necessitating their erasure from official record. Mechanicus perspectives provide complementary insight. Internal notes indicate that the gene seed of the Lost Legions exhibited characteristics inconsistent with standard distribution protocols. One set contained adaptive neural pathways designed to enhance initiative and problem-solving in volatile scenarios. The other displayed elevated psychic sensitivity, potentially augmenting cohesion and morale across entire companies. While both traits offered strategic advantages, they simultaneously introduced unpredictability at scales the Administratum could not quantify or regulate. Redaction protocols, therefore, were employed not merely as a historical censorship measure, but as a corrective engineering solution intended to maintain systemic stability across all Imperial operations. The deletion of logistical records, fleet manifests, and battle reports had immediate consequences for subsequent Administratum and Mechanicus operations. Later campaigns were characterized by increased standardization of resource allocation, stricter oversight of fleet commanders, and heightened embedding of tech priests within all active legions. These measures reflect an institutional response to the irregularities observed in the campaigns of the Lost Primarchs, demonstrating that the consequences of their operational autonomy persisted long after their disappearance. In essence, the Purge reshaped Imperial doctrine, embedding a bias toward predictability and centralization that continues to influence Astartes' operations millennia later. The combined analysis of Administratum and Mechanicus records thus frames the Lost Primarchs not as failures of strategy, but as catalysts for systemic recalibration. The Adaptive Primarchs' emphasis on flexible command and environmental responsiveness revealed the limits of Imperium-wide coordination, while the Empathic Primarchs' focus on unit cohesion and synchronized assault highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in total dependency on centralized command. Their operational extremes, though effective in isolated engagements, were incompatible with the Imperium's broader logistical and doctrinal frameworks. In final assessment, both institutions recognize the duality of the Lost Primarchs' impact. The Adaptive Legion demonstrates the potential of autonomy, ingenuity, and tactical improvisation, whereas the Empathic Legion exemplifies the power of cohesion, synchronized action, and morale-driven efficiency. Administratum records emphasize the systemic risks their continued operation would have presented, while Mechanicus reports underscore the biological and technological unpredictabilities inherent to their gene seed and cybernetic integration. Together, these perspectives reveal that the Primarch's erasure, though historically traumatic, was executed as a deliberate and necessary measure to maintain the Imperium's operational integrity. Even in deletion, the Lost Primarchs left behind structural echoes, irregularities in records, anomalies in gene seed archives, and residual deviations in fleet deployment patterns. For the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus, these traces remain a subject of continuous study, representing both the enduring consequences of extreme autonomy and a cautionary exemplar of the limits imposed upon even the Emperor's most extraordinary creations. The earliest Inquisition reports regarding the Lost Primarchs emerge from classified evaluations of long-deleted campaign logs, fragments of fleet deployment manifests, and genetic anomalies discovered during the Great Crusade and the early years of the Horus Heresy. These reports, preserved in sealed vaults and occasionally cross-referenced by inquisitorial operatives, describe irregularities that resisted standard classification. Agents of the Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Xenos noted that the absence of two entire Primarchs legions created inconsistencies in both planetary compliance metrics and war outcome reconstructions, prompting formal inquiry into the causes of these anomalies. Inquisitorial observers described these discrepancies with clinical detachment, noting that standard investigation protocols were often insufficient to account for the missing data. In some records, operations on critical worlds reflected entire fleets unaccounted for in Admiralty and Administratum logs, and gene seed distribution registries displayed gaps corresponding to unassigned templates. These anomalies were initially interpreted as clerical error or archival decay, yet subsequent cross-analysis revealed that the patterns were deliberate. Deletion protocols had been executed with precision, leaving only trace residuals for the Inquisition to uncover. Some fragments suggest that the Lost Primarch's presence produced effects that were fundamentally unquantifiable. Sensor readings recovered from orbital survey platforms indicate energy signatures and psychic fluxes inconsistent with the known attributes of surviving Primarchs. These disturbances were noted in early dossiers and described as temporal distortions in command coherence or unexplained alterations in battlefield synchrony, terms later sanitized in summary reports. While the Inquisition cannot confirm the source of these phenomena, the preserved notes imply that agents considered them significant enough to warrant careful, ongoing observation. Several reports describe localized populations exhibiting unusual behavioral adaptations in response to the Lost Primarchs campaigns. In worlds classified as fully pacified by standard Imperial forces, later inquisitorial reviews found that surviving civilian and servitor populations retained anomalous coordination patterns, both in civil labor and in defensive mobilization, far exceeding expected organizational capacity. Some agents speculated that these adaptations resulted from the Empathic Legion's capacity to transmit morale and command influence across vast troop formations. While this remains unverified, the documentation emphasizes that the effect was detectable even decades later, hinting at the enduring reach of the Lost Primarch's operational imprint. Inquisitorial dossiers also note occurrences that border on the inexplicable. Surveillance logs from multiple star systems record the presence of armored forces operating in configurations that match the hypothesized patterns of the Lost Legions, yet no administrative authorization or fleet designation exists. Some agents hypothesize that remnants of these legions survived in isolation, perhaps assimilated into other military structures, though no evidence substantiates these claims. Such reports are typically redacted, classified under the heading Obscured Compliance Operations, and remains sealed due to concerns regarding the destabilizing potential of disclosure. The unexplainable nature of certain phenomena is further compounded by genetic irregularities noted during limited sampling. Ordoxenos field reports describe gene seed fragments recovered from destroyed fortifications and battlefields with attributes not observed in any surviving legions. In particular, one sequence exhibits a combination of adaptive neural plasticity and enhanced psychic resonance, aligning with the theorized profiles of the adaptive and empathic Lost Primarchs. Mechanicus corroboration is limited due to purge chain protocols, yet the Inquisition preserved select analytical summaries, emphasizing that these fragments were anomalous and likely deliberate in design. Sealed Inquisition records also reference phenomena classified as operational eco-effects, whereby battle strategies of the Lost Legions appear to imprint on subsequent campaigns conducted by other legions. Reports note that formations in later engagements sometimes unconsciously mirrored maneuver patterns or assault timing once observed in these redacted operations. Analysts have suggested that this may be a residual consequence of the Lost Primarch's unique command influence, but verification remains impossible, as all direct records were systematically purged. The Inquisition treats these echoes with caution, neither confirming nor denying the presence of lingering psychic or tactical influence. Additional observations highlight the difficulty of reconstructing the Lost Primarch's impact. Interrogations of surviving commanders from partially erased campaigns consistently reference unfamiliar patterns of command or untraceable tactical signatures, phrases indicative of operations beyond conventional comprehension. These accounts, however, are largely treated as anecdotal within the official archives. Inquisitorial cross-referencing attempts to reconcile them with surviving battle telemetry and fleet movement data reveal multiple inconsistencies, yet a coherent pattern emerges. The Lost Primarch's operational presence was both highly effective and fundamentally resistant to standard oversight or replication. Finally, archival analysis notes that many anomalies are interrelated, forming a systemic network of observations that spans multiple sectors and campaign theatres. Sensor readings, genetic anomalies, and population behaviour patterns converge in ways that defy simple explanation, prompting the Inquisition to classify the Lost Primarch's imprint as a persistent operational enigma. Agents conclude that while the Lost Primarchs were actively removed from official records, traces of their influence remain detectable through residual behavioural, genetic and tactical phenomena. The cumulative effect is a series of observations that cannot be fully quantified, yet cannot be entirely dismissed, leaving the Inquisition with enduring questions regarding the nature, scope, and potential survivability of the erased Primarchs. The Inquisition archives preserve multiple references to anomalous military engagements that correlate with the hypothesized operational footprint of the Lost Primarchs. These anomalies manifest primarily as inconsistencies between expected campaign outcomes and material evidence from the field. Ordo Hereticus field reports frequently note that engagements attributed to generic Astartes forces contain patterns of efficiency, coordination, and tactical ingenuity exceeding the capabilities of known legions. These observations often originate from partial battle telemetry recovered from destroyed fortifications, orbital sensor logs, and the intermittent reconstructions of administratum field clerks tasked with post-action reporting. One recurring anomaly involves battle sequences in the Volturnus system, where reports describe the rapid pacification of multiple hive cities simultaneously. Fleet manifests indicate that standard troop allocation could not account for the speed or precision of these operations. Sealed Inquisition dossiers speculate that one of the Lost Primarchs employed a form of distributed command that allowed simultaneous maneuvering across multiple theatres without direct oversight. While unverified, these reports suggest an unprecedented integration of psychic resonance, tactical foresight, and logistical synchronization. Mechanicus verification is limited due to the extensive use of purge chain protocols, yet surviving data fragments reinforce the assertion that operations were conducted beyond conventional Imperial parameters. Another documented encounter occurs during the suppression of insurgent uprisings on the industrial world of Carthax IX. Inquisition operatives later noted discrepancies between recorded casualty reports and recovered battlefield evidence. Surviving records indicate that forces attributed to unidentified Astartes units neutralized heavily fortified positions with minimal apparent force expenditure. Analysts hypothesize that the empathic Lost Primarch may have employed advanced cohesion techniques, allowing units to execute complex maneuvers in near-perfect synchrony. Though these claims cannot be definitively confirmed, the pattern is consistent with earlier Administratum and Mechanicus inferences regarding their operational doctrine. Sealed reports further document instances of anomalous survivability among both troops and civilian populations in areas previously engaged by the Lost Primarchs forces. Intelligence summaries describe defensive structures and settlement recoveries that reflect sophisticated preparation and strategic foresight. Some documents suggest that residual command influence may have persisted even after the Primarch's formal disappearance, affecting both surviving soldiers and planetary infrastructure in ways that cannot be entirely explained. The Inquisition treats these reports with caution, noting that they could reflect either advanced martial coordination or a form of residual psychic or mimetic imprint. A particularly notable anomaly is recorded during operations in the cluster later designated as Segmentum Pacificus. Observations indicate that tactical formations employed during engagement exhibited patterns that reappear in multiple unconnected theatres over a span of several decades. This phenomenon, referred to in sealed logs as echoed manoeuvre signatures, has no confirmed explanation. Inquisitorial analysts note that these repeated patterns suggest either an enduring influence of the Lost Primarchs' original operational doctrines or the survival of residual elements of their legions operating under unrecognized command structures. Some speculate that surviving Astartes units may have retained partial conditioning derived from the empathic legion's synchronization techniques, though direct evidence remains absent. Encounters with unidentified or unclassified forces further complicate the historical record. Intelligence fragments describe skirmishes with Xenos combatants and insurgent factions in regions simultaneously targeted by the Lost Primarchs. Battle telemetry indicates engagement patterns inconsistent with known Legion doctrines. Some reports suggest the use of adaptive strike formations capable of rapid terrain exploitation, ambush mitigation, and unconventional deployment of artillery or support units. These tactical anomalies align with the inferred strategies of the adaptive Lost Primarch and provide circumstantial evidence of their direct involvement, though the Inquisition categorically notes that these claims remain unconfirmed. Several sealed dossiers detail interactions between Imperial forces and populations displaying unexplained behavioral adaptation. In some cases, surviving inhabitants of contested worlds displayed advanced defensive coordination, evasion tactics, and organizational efficiency inconsistent with known technological capabilities or standard Astartes instruction. Some Inquisition records tentatively suggest that these effects may derive from lingering psychic influence or training methodologies employed by the Lost Primarchs, particularly the Empathic Legion. While the correlation is strong, the lack of surviving records and the deliberate purging of primary documents prevent definitive attribution. In addition to operational anomalies, surviving archives indicate significant logistical irregularities associated with campaigns linked to the Lost Primarchs. Sealed Mechanicus transmissions describe inconsistencies in supply requisitions, fleet movements, and material allocation. These irregularities, while largely sanitized in public administratum reports, suggest that the Primarchs operated outside standard command and supply protocols. The Inquisition considers these discrepancies significant, interpreting them as evidence of systemic autonomy that may have contributed to the decision to erase both Primarchs from official record. The combination of anomalous combat outcomes, residual influence on both troops and civilian populations, and inconsistencies in logistical records presents a pattern that the Inquisition has repeatedly classified as unexplainable but operationally significant. Agents note that, even in the absence of direct evidence, the observable consequences of the Lost Primarchs' actions continue to manifest across sectors. Tactical echoes, residual psychic resonance, and unexplained synchronization in surviving formations all point to an enduring impact that persists despite the erasure of primary documentation. Finally, it is worth noting that many of these anomalies exist in corroborated clusters, meaning that multiple independent sources, including administratum clerks, mechanicus tech priests, and inquisitorial field agents, observed similar irregularities across separate campaigns and worlds. While no direct records of the Lost Primarchs remain, the convergence of these observations strengthens the inference that their influence extended across multiple theatres, affecting operational doctrine, tactical execution, and logistical processes in ways that were anomalous relative to all other recorded legions. These cumulative findings, preserved in sealed files and ongoing surveillance reports, provide the foundation for further investigation. The Inquisition continues to classify and monitor residual phenomena associated with the Lost Primarchs, recognizing that the absence of official records does not equate to the absence of effect. Unquantified, persistent, and enigmatic, these anomalies remain a central concern for understanding both the limits of Imperial control and the enduring consequences of the Emperor's missing sons. The most sensitive Inquisition archives pertaining to the Lost Primarchs are contained in files designated as Level Omega Red, accessible only to senior Inquisitors and select Ordo Hereticus personnel. These documents include cross-references from multiple sectors, partial battle logs, cryptic telemetric readings, and genetic samples retrieved from destroyed fortifications or quarantined planets. While much of this material has been redacted or sanitized for general circulation, surviving annotations provide limited insight into the scope and impact of the Lost Primarch's operational footprint. Classified files indicate that certain campaigns formerly attributed to generic Astartes units were, in fact, conducted under direct supervision of these missing Primarchs. Tactical reconstructions derived from partially preserved fleet telemetry and planetary sensor logs reveal maneuvers and assault sequences markedly distinct from those of surviving legions. Analysts noted unusually rapid pacification rates, extreme coordination among dispersed companies, and the repeated occurrence of phenomena later labelled as psychic echo effects. These anomalies were initially catalogued as operational outliers, but were later elevated to the status of potential systemic irregularities, requiring immediate attention. Several sealed dossiers document interactions with unclassified or anomalous forces. These include insurgent populations, Xenos combatants, and environmental hazards whose behaviours and strategic responses were inexplicably mitigated by forces aligned with the Lost Primarchs. Some records, still partially legible, reference emergent command harmonics and adaptive initiative beyond standard parameters. While the Inquisition cannot confirm the precise mechanisms underlying these phenomena, it remains evident that the Lost Primarchs exercise control and influence at scales that exceeded conventional understanding. Analysts cautiously speculate that these effects may have originated from genetically augmented leadership abilities, psycho-reactive training of their legions, or a combination thereof. Other classified files emphasize the difficulty of tracing the Lost Primarch's actions post-campaign. Administratum and Mechanicus cross-references note multiple instances of systematic data deletion, redirection of supply lines, and obfuscation of fleet movements. The Inquisition interprets these measures as deliberate attempts to erase operational past, possibly in response to concerns over the Legion's autonomy, unpredictability, or systemic risk. Certain entries describe purge chain activation protocols, which effectively removed any trace of the Primarch's logistical and strategic presence. Though these actions ensure the stability of wider Imperial operations, they also created enduring gaps in historical knowledge, leaving the Inquisition with fragments of a pattern that can only be partially reconstructed. The remaining classified observations highlight persistent anomalies that defy straightforward explanation. Some planets formerly engaged by the Lost Primarchs' forces exhibit unusual population behaviours decades later, including enhanced coordination in labour, defence, and governance. Sensor and reconnaissance logs occasionally capture residual psychic patterns or unaccounted for energy signatures. While speculative, The Inquisition considers these residual effects as indicative of lasting influence, potentially stemming from empathic command techniques, adaptive tactical oversight, or previously unknown genetic augmentations inherent to the Lost Primarchs themselves. A particularly noteworthy cluster of sealed documents refers to so-called echoed engagement phenomena, in which surviving Astartes formations unconsciously replicate maneuvers or operational timing observed during Lost Legion campaigns. Some analysts hypothesize that this is evidence of enduring imprinting, either through residual psychic influence or procedural conditioning that survived systemic erasure. Mechanicus and Order Hereticus commentary consistently marks these findings as significant yet unverified, emphasizing that while patterns are detectable, causation cannot be definitively established. Final analysis from the Inquisition's perspective frames the Lost Primarchs as both extraordinary instruments of war and enduring enigmas. Their operational autonomy, genetic enhancements, and psychological imprint on troops introduced capabilities that exceeded known standards while simultaneously creating systemic unpredictabilities. Administratum oversight, Mechanicus evaluation, and inquisitorial investigation converge to suggest that while the Lost Primarchs were erased to maintain Imperial stability, their influence continues to manifest indirectly through residual effects, unexplained tactical patterns, and environmental or social anomalies across multiple sectors. In conclusion, the Lost Primarchs represent a duality. Their very existence posed unquantifiable risk to the structural integrity of the Great Crusade. The Inquisition recognizes that the absence of direct evidence does not equate to absence of effect. Residual psychic influence, anomalous battle patterns, and behavioral echoes in populations and surviving troops constitute a form of enduring legacy, one that challenges the limits of both Imperial oversight and historical reconstruction. In this sense, the Lost Primarchs remain a subject of active investigation, their true scope and impact only partially discernible, but undeniably profound, a persistent enigma at the edge of known Imperial history.